Everybody, Chris Armiger from Fort Myers Beach Fire Department. Um, so, case study for this week was I actually went with the first one in the chapter, the Newfoundland hurricane of 1775. I read, all the other ones, most of the other ones, but this one stood out to me for a particular reason, and that was just because it really dealt with uh, issues related to like total lack of communication and issues that you would expect to deal with. I mean, obviously to an exaggerated degree, but issues you would expect to deal with when you lose communication, technology, all from modern power, not having access to not to modern power. So like if you had a um, response or an incident that you were planning for or whatever that dealt with a major disaster and you want to go all the way back to like we're starting from scratch, like there's no battery backup, there's no backup power plant generator, stuff like that. Like if you want to really try to reference your planning or your decision making or your response matrix or whatever from like ground zero, then this was a good case study to kind of look at because of all those instances. Just the date, 1775, so it had over 200 years ago. It was right around the time of the American Revolution. So the premise of this one was, there's a catastrophic hurricane that comes up the eastern seaboard, North Carolina, I think, where it first makes landfall and goes all the way up through Canada. And it just devastates everything on the eastern seaboard all the way up the shore. And it's happening at the same time as the American Revolution, so you have the 13 original colonies. And there's some infrastructure in place, but really not a lot. So then issues come up. They start with stage one of the disasters. There's a hurricane coming. And how did they know there was a hurricane coming then? Well, even then, they had established that there was, in fact, a hurricane or storm season. Even back then, they knew in September, October, those were the times of year where they had the most frequent, intense storms coming from the Atlantic, and they knew that, because of um, shipping and maritime coming from England back and forth to the U.S. So there was already a history of hurricanes and severe storms. So they knew that, but there was never really there didn't exist yet like a metric or a scale for magnitude, and there was zero uh, you know ways to predict these things. They just knew that in this particular time of year, they could expect heavy and intense storms that were historically greater and lasted longer than any other time of the year. But what's interesting is, so when you reference it from an emergency management point of view as a case study, um, if you kind of skip towards the end and you start talking about like the lessons learned and key issues raised from the case study, a lot of the stuff that you start to consider and you start to think about are problems that we could see pretty quickly today. Katrina is a great example where this case study dealt specifically or mentioned specifically a lot of times infrastructure. So you have to like beef up infrastructure for these sort of incidents. So what happened is what you learn about in this case study is to compare it to Katrina, when the dams and the levees went. So you have to consider civil engineering in your planning. Right? So when the dams and the levees went, the damage from the failure of that type of infrastructure was more catastrophic had that infrastructure not existed and the geography was in its natural state and the hurricane would have just gone by. So you really need to, to modernize that, to move that forward now 220 some years. You really, 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 as we expand, globally, but specifically in our country, we've pretty much saturated the shorelines on each side of our country. So as we start to move towards the center, we really, really, really have to make an effort with civil engineering and planning to design our habitats, our communities, in a way that is less impactful on the geography of wherever we want to establish ourselves, and make sure that we have ways to reinforce that, when times are needed, or to use the natural geography to our advantage versus trying to fight against it, just for space. And then communication was really the other biggest takeaway from this. So the aspects of communication, you lose everything. So most realistic to today would be like, the our 800, our digital radio system goes down, and then we start using the 800s, or rather the VHF. That goes down, then you have ham operators. So as in terms of like redundancy, going from high tech to low tech, are considerations that you might actually at some point have to hand deliver messages. You might have to have couriers setting up centralized, predetermined but centralized locations for messaging. Because the thing is, you want a consistent message for everything during and after an incident, pre, during, and post incident. So what you want to avoid at all costs is misinformation or competing information. So to have established routes, established locations to move messages is something that was referenced in this book, and they had that sorted out then, not to the degree that they needed because they were really, really behind. And then just because this is going kind of long, the last thing I want to hit on is the public health component of this. So they had almost, I think one of the things I read said they had 4,000 dead. But you have a huge public health crisis, and the same thing that can happen today is, we have DMORT, DMAT teams, USAR, and we mobilize, especially DMORT, DMAT, if we have, a lot of loss of life. And that's, it looks good on TV, right? We don't want to see dead bodies on TV, and that's horrible. Nobody wants to. But the big reason we do that is public health and safety, right? Contamination. We don't want to make more people sick. So we really have to rectify those sort of issues, and then getting other health services to where they need to go. You can rebuild. You can get food and supplies and all those other things to where they need to go eventually. In these circumstances, 200 some years ago, it was catastrophic just to find building material, just to find food, because you had to grow it, you had to source it. It's just not like a Home Depot call. Like, you don't call the other side of the country and have stuff brought to you. So obviously, in this case, it was much more significant. But the point I'm making is public health, at least in my opinion, is really paramount, because you can have all the resources, you can have all the food, and you can have all the systems and plans to have that stuff couriered in or brought into you. Same thing with supplies for building and for infrastructure repair and all that other stuff. But if you don't have a healthy population to utilize it, then all that stuff's really worthless. So if you can't address public health immediately, you're going to have a really, really big problem, regardless of what other resources you have planned for or you have available to you. Last little tidbit was I found a novel. It's fiction, but it's based a lot on nonfiction historical references that was relevant to this, or rather about this. So I think someday I might make an effort to read it. All the reviews are really good, but it was interesting just because it presents. It's from the viewpoint, and they use factual references of how people perceived those types of incidents in that generation, and how they responded and reacted to how it impacted them. So I think it would just be a good reference to have in the back of my mind for, worst case scenario, if things go real bad, this is what it looks like. If we go from super high tech to super low tech, and all that can happen really, really fast, this is kind of what something like that might look like. So I look forward to seeing everybody else's posts, watching your videos. Thanks for taking the time to watch mine. I know it's super long, but just lots to talk about in this one. So we'll see you next week. Thanks.